Hello. This essay will introduce an Audible Semiotics, primarily through a critique of James Williams' 2016 book, A Process Philosophy of Signs. The argument presented is that while Williams' work is valuable for aiming to broaden the life of signs by granting them their own intensive relations, his process semiotics fails when considered audibly. An audible process philosophy of signs, by contrast, returns to a semiotics in which a sign exists only as it is gathered and granted attention. To be audible is to be attentive to how hearing and listening are different. This difference helps us to open creative thought to a wider range of possibilities in cinema sound. Semiotics and semiology are terms that describe methods of classifying ambiguous sign relations in language, symbolic thought, and everyday experience. The field gained its most influential status in the late 19th and early 20th centuries through Charles Saunders Peirce in the United States and Ferdinand de Saussure in France. Saussure's linguistic study developed the now well-known signifier-signified relationship that constitutes a sign. The example offered is the word tree as a signifier and the concept tree as signified. The two comprise a unit. The meaning of a signified in a signifier is a sign of potential meaning. This dialectical relation carries an arbitrary association of the concept to imply the idea of the whole. Listening for Saussure is to language, as or in language. Listening to language is less an interpretation of things and their actions, and more an interpretation that functions within the system of language as such. Saussure's semiology carries over to French cinema through theorists such as Christian Metz. Rather than language as the code of signification, the formal elements of cinema present images, sounds, symbols, and iconography, which function as a connotative and denotative structure that is named as a language. For Metz, cinema can only be cinema because it uses this connotative and denotative structure. That is, without it being a language, it is simply a series of images and sounds. This is a debatable conclusion in film theory. Gilles Deleuze, for example, took Metz to task for the latter's claim that images are reducible to analogical signs and for presuming a language or language system that does not exist. Deleuze instead regards cinema as a simultaneous movement of images and signs. Sign here is neither linguistic nor analogical, but rather expressive. Neither image nor sign refers as a language does, rather they do their own work of expressing and differentiating. Deleuze picks up from Peirce, whose semiotics emphasize experience rather than language. A key element of Peirce's taxonomy is the index, which is a sign which refers to the object that it denotes by virtue of being really affected by that object. An index works for sound and audibility because it describes the activity of a real, individual unit that directs the attention, but which does not resemble the object. Peirce uses examples of hearing, a sound, in his descriptions, but he places the point of emphasis on the sound rather than the hearing of it. Deleuze applies Peirce's work to produce a temporal semiotics of images, which themselves function in semiotic relations, expressing in their composition and recombinations. That is, while Deleuze writes that cinema is made of images and signs, the latter constitutes the field of relationships that makes images expressive. Deleuze's semiotic metaphysics is weak in regard to sound outside of music or language, yet his semiotics implies a complex matrix of relations that functions well for audible signs. Extrapolating his thought specifically to listening, the act is less about identifying the object and more about the action of the mind in interpreting what is underway in the relationship. Further, in the creative arts of sound design, the creative act becomes less about an adherence to sound to object or image, and instead the development of an audible matrix through an array of sounds and hearings for interpretation. An audible philosophy of signs, notable for the practice of film sound design, emphasizes not the thing, but rather the conscious relation, the gathering of the sign as an interpretive act. This comprises the following tripartite audible relation: an object event, a sonic event, and an audible event. A cinematic hearing is one in which one's mind must do the relational work from the ambiguity that makes a sign, that is, rendering an audible event from a sonic event. Treating each element psychologically rather than materially, a sound designer is able to find different combinations among the three, detach particular elements, or create ambiguous closures from assumed relations. In cinema sound design, it is not important that the object, sound, and hearing match, rather that the very relation is ambiguous. The element of relation is important in returning to a critique of Williams' process philosophy of signs. Rather than signifier-signified mediation or analogical translation, a process account describes multiplicity and intensity. All of this is to say that the sign for Williams is not bound to any pre-existing set of relations. Williams takes from Deleuze the notion of intensive relations rather than extensive ones. The sign pre-exists, it has its own life independent of any consciousness. Williams argues that we should not conceive of different typologies of signs or a variety of sign worlds. Instead, every sign is a world connected to all others. Williams aims to overturn semiological attachments to language, use, meaning, and consciousness. His semiotics proposes decoupling the link between humans and signs. In this, there is no Saussurean union or Peircean relation. The only relations occur within itself and within the networks any sign produces through its life. His launching point is a critique of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who states in the Philosophical Investigations that a sign is dead until it is given life through use. This fragment is rendered in the popular 2009 English translation as, "Every sign by itself seems dead. What gives it life? In use it lives. Is it there that it has a living breath within it, or is the use its breath?" However, Williams relies on an older 1958 translation, which incorrectly translates the final atem as life rather than breath. This misrepresentation does not defeat Williams' own vibrant concept of a philosophy of signs, but this language of a living use does function as the crux of his turn against Wittgenstein. Where Wittgenstein emphasizes breath prior to use, Williams counters signs as processes are alive prior to their use. We can speculate on Wittgenstein's intentions, but he's clearly stating the importance of an activity that is a process. In its use, it's breathing. In its breathing is its use. There is no duality here, as Williams claims, but a co-relational and active activating process. Williams addresses an important problem shared with audible philosophy as proposed here, to break the entrenched dependence on language, logic, reason, and subjectivity in Western philosophy. His method of overcoming this is to describe the process of signs as if they are the life that is significant, that they have their own life within a substratum of activity. In reading Wittgenstein's sign as dead until given life through use, Williams renders a problematic dualism of inert matter and meaningful sign. He replaces meaning with intensity, claiming this as the basis of the sign that is haunted by its prior life. Meaning involves linguistic understanding, Williams states, while significance is broader. Williams' sign is self-sufficient. There is no subject of the selection and no goal, no law governing it. Rather, the more familiar conception of semiotics as reference and signification, Williams emphasizes a priority of selection, that is, a selected set in process against a wider background. As to why selection is preferable to, or more ontologically accurate than, use, is an argument that is never made clearly. Also unclear is whether, in discounting consciousness, sensation, attention, or attraction, has any importance. In his effort to counter a linguistic dominance in regard to signs, he has decoupled the abstract role of communication. There is great value here in opening the possibilities of expression beyond the limitations of a rational subject. The problem is that in his opposition, Williams' response reifies the limits he aims to overcome. He shares with Saussure a presumption that consciousness is only capable of linguistic thought. For Williams, it seems that there is only language thought or there is sign matter life. In his fight against dualism, he has produced his own opposition of matter against consciousness. Williams thereby falls into the same trap he accuses Wittgenstein of, that language is the limit of thought. Neither Wittgenstein nor Williams hits upon the relevance and conceptual function of this term sign, at least insofar as it is audible and in process. If we read Wittgenstein's meaning and use as linguistic, it is limited in its possibilities. Williams' selection, meanwhile, is limited in its material opposition to a solely linguistic consciousness. His process philosophy of signs echoes aspects of French film theory, which states that cinema can only be itself when it is regarded as language, and if not, it is a chaos of images. In fact, cinema transcends language, and its best means of doing so is not through the representation of images or material reality, but through the hearing and listening that is non-linguistic. The problem with Williams' account of signs is that he has conflated two different terms, indeed two different processes, sign and life. Any sign, he states, pre-exists its use or meaning, but what he describes is life, not a sign. He describes the activity of signs as special kinds of processes which brings things into relation, and signs may be processes before they are in use. Further, that signs are always networks of conscious intensive processes. There is no gathering in any of this, no person, animal, or thing taking account. The sign is always alive, Williams writes, always in process. But this is true only insofar as it is made through attention. If not, it is life itself, not a sign. Williams offers a continuity of living processes across all states of the sign, but this is not the sign. These are the transcendental conditions of any sign, the activity of possible signification, human or otherwise. Wittgenstein was right. The sign requires a moment or duration of enlivening, a breathing process to become a sign. Life is the process that requires becoming as a sign. Life indeed has a multiplicity of semiotic relations, human and non-human, but the sign is not what lives. Life lives. Williams' formation fails for audibility because he differentiates only the linguistic and the visual. This limits experience, produces a division, and fails to regard human cognition and affectivity outside the old modes of signification. He splits existence in a manner far more divisive than Wittgenstein. An audible philosophy of signs avoids these trappings. It does not limit meaning to any pre-existing diagram, because hearing and listening have no a priori structure. It is human and non-human in its process of activity, and thus has no division between species. It recognizes that life moves of its own accord, and that this process is infinitely plural, coexisting, and simultaneous. From this, a sign may be gathered. The critique offered here is not to advocate a turn toward defending a sonic event as a material sign, but to argue that the sign constitutes a relationship in audibility. The audible sign is one kind of sign, a different sign than other types. For Williams, the sign determines life. In an Audible Semiotics, the sign gives life to thought, affectivity, action, and modification, and vice versa. Williams' semiotics works through the multiplicity and variability of material relations. Audible Semiotics works through the multiplicity and variability of material and sensory affective relations. An Audible Semiotics retains and emphasizes the sensory to seek other avenues of discovery and thought beyond language and vision. In audibility, the sign returns us to its relational element, not by returning to language nor by elevating its material status, but acknowledging that a sign can only be a sign in its gathering as a sign. Williams concentrates on visual and linguistic signs, but he does offer an audible example, which allows us to both critique his philosophy and also turn it towards the audible. Further, it helps us think cinematically about the possibility of sound design in film. His example is the hearing of a group of deer in a forest, which presents a sign that their activity may trigger an avalanche. So here's his quote in full, and then we'll break it down. Quote, for example, as you trek along an unstable ice and snow front, you hear the soft but growing crunching sound of deer leaping above and to the side of you. They are hungry and panicked. The cliff is melting and unstable, so you begin to compute the grim possibilities around the impending avalanche, listening to the hoof impacts. Where is the border between the dead sign, and the live ones? Is it at the point where you once studied about deer coming lower down the mountain due to starvation? Or when you first unconsciously registered their leaps as a presentiment of bad things about to happen? Or is it when you begin to act? Or when the deer first suffer from the effects of a harsh winter? Or when you begin some kind of linguistic analysis of the languages of avalanche survival techniques and animal movements? According to my claim, he says, any cut or definitive answer at the point of use is an abstraction from continuous processes, because the cut will draw an artificial line between connected processes, end quote. Okay, let's take a close look at every phrase of the scenario he depicts and critique his statements from an audible perspective. Williams writes, quote, as you trek along an unstable ice and snow front, you hear the soft but growing crunching sound, end quote. At this point in his description, you have heard a sound. A sonic event has become an audible event. The conclusion he presumes you drew came in the continuance of his sentence, quote, of deer leaping above and to the side of you. They are hungry and panicked, end quote. He does not say how you know that it is a deer. The error here is in immediately naming a specific entity from a sound. He also does not say whether you only heard it or saw and heard it, or if one sensation came before the other. Each of these states would unfold a different process of interpretation and understanding. However, we can assume from the complete narrative that you only heard and did not see it. The first critique here is that Williams is discounting the ambiguity of your state of hearing, presuming you can automatically identify and name the connection. Second, he presumes that from your hearing you also know, through the sonic event, that they are hungry and panicked. Quote, the cliff is melting and unstable, end quote. This is the prior and continuing condition of an environment in which you found yourself. You know what the situation is, and you are in the midst of it. Since you have consciously confirmed that deer are panicking within your current situation, you have taken meaning and concluded you are in danger. This is what brings the meaning of the sign, which requires no language. Quote, so you begin to compute the grim possibilities around the impending avalanche, listening to the hoof impacts, end quote. We can presume you're considering the implications of this danger as both the sonic event and your listening continues within the audible event. There is a gathering and a taking account within the condition you are automatically immersed in. This brings a durational coexistence of sound, sense, thought, mood, and environment that increases the sense of how to survive this situation. Quote, where is the border between the dead sign and the live ones? End quote. The question is the heart of Williams' description of this scenario and also his overall thesis. The answer is simple. There is no dead sign. There is the breathing flux of sonic and audible life, which simultaneously overlap and coexist. From this, a sign emerged and became enlivened through your condition of hearing that is turning toward thought in listening. Quote, is it at the point where you once studied about deer coming down the mountain due to starvation? End quote. The answer is no. Your knowledge of deer is your experience and your memory that you have gathered in life that preceded this event. Quote, or when you first unconsciously registered their leaps, end quote. This is the sign, but it is not leaps. As William James reminds us, the word within the formal structures of language and an audible sensation are not the same. Naming is its own mental process, different from the sensation Williams describes. A more accurate description of this event would be when you first became attuned to an event that is plural. The index triggers the co-compositional relation of the sonic event, the object event, sonic event, and audible event that manifests as a sign. Quote, as a presentiment of bad things about to happen, end quote. This is the duration in which listening is doing the work of reasoning, which is different from hearing. Quote, or simply when you begin some kind of linguistic analysis of the languages of avalanche, survival techniques, and animal movements, end quote. Here the sign only remains as a resonance into a more highly reasoned organization of what has been gathered as the audible event and translated into language. James calls the change to language thought as the moment we abandon mental images for the definite and unchangeable names which they suggest. This may occur or it may not. If it does, it enters into the pre-existing semiological structure of language. If it does not, perhaps it becomes something else, a moving image, a reverie, a zen-like calm, or a flight or otherwise bodily affective response. But the broader point is that there is not a strict takeover of language from sensation, rather a multiplicity that we can describe as a vibration or resonance from many durations of signification. 7. Okay, sorry, I've been numbering these. Quote, according to my claim, any cut or definitive answer at the point of use is an abstraction from continuous processes because the cut will draw an artificial line between connected processes, end quote. This assessment is only true regarding what happens from gathering the audible sign. The cut of abstraction is not the sign, it is the use, which usually constitutes some combination of conclusion, instinct, response, and perhaps action. Therefore, as audible, use and sign are not the same, but they are intimately connected. Concluding now, the issue with both Wittgenstein and Williams is the presumption that language is the limit of thought. Where the former dwells thoughtfully in this limit, the latter aims to abandon it. This notion of language as the limit returns us to the problems of French film theory, which states that cinema can only be itself when it is regarded as language. In fact, cinema transcends language through, as Deleuze suggests, the images and signs that indicate, infer, suggest, and build relationships. What Wittgenstein, Williams, and Deleuze all fail to account for, however, is that an audible semiotics is the best means of tackling the problems of a living semiotics, whether this is in regard to everyday experience or cinema. Audibility escapes the limits of language and images in coexisting and passing through both. In thinking signs and their capacities in film creativity, sound offers hearings and listenings that are more deeply interpretable, non-linguistic, and perhaps as well non-human. An audible process philosophy of signs recognizes a distinction of life, events, their signs, and their plurality and their difference. Signs exist only in their attention within the flux of life and the events that compose it. Symbols and icons can be made and ignored, but an audible sign ignored never happened. Thank you for listening.